Welcome, everybody. I guess we're ready to get started. Thank you for joining us for buying and selling restaurants. It's a good, beefy program today. We're going to be talking about key money deals. We do tons of them in this law firm. We work with our guest, Cosmo Montemoro. Great name, great person. He is the owner of Murrow Realty, and they do a ton of key money deals. We work together all the time. He's on the street. He's talking to landlords. He's talking to restaurant owners. Nobody knows what's going on better than Cosmo. Welcome, Cosmo. I'm so happy to have you.
Hello, everyone.
So we're going to dive into it. And first thing I'm going to do is kind of go over the basic jargon that you need to understand when we're talking about key money deals. There's things you just need to know. A lot of you know them, some of you don't. I'm going to hustle through them. First of all, when we're talking about buying and selling a restaurant, we're talking about key money. Why is it called key money? I don't know. I guess because you're supposed to be able to give somebody money and they give you the keys and you can open a restaurant, but there's no way that's what happens. So key money is a little bit of a misnomer, but it's still what we call it in the biz. After key money, we have something called an LOI, also known as a term sheet. Those two terms are interchangeable. Letter of intent is what LOI means. Term sheet is a term sheet. These are the basic terms of the deal. You walk in, you talk to somebody, he's selling the restaurant, you want to buy it, you go through the terms, how much, when's it going to happen, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to talk about all of that stuff, but you have to know what that means. When the deal comes to fruition and we actually go to contract, it's called an asset purchase agreement. You are buying or selling the assets of your business. In shorthand, we call these APAs. You also need to know about your lease. Part of the deal is going to be that the buyer is going to take over the lease or get a new lease. So there'll be one of a couple of things that will happen. There'll be a lease assignment. That is when you, the seller, assigns the lease over to the buyer. There might be a lease modification where the buyer takes over the existing lease, but changes a couple of things that they don't like about it. But sometimes there's also a lease extension, which means that the buyer takes over the lease, but they extend it because there's only, let's say, 2 or 3 years left. And no one's going to buy your business if there's just no time left on it. Another thing we need to know is escrow. That is an account usually held by your attorney. When there is a deposit given, we put the money into escrow. Due diligence is a time period where the buyer is looking into the seller's debts, liabilities, the landlord's reputation, the lease, etc., making sure that they are diligently researching what's going on. So when they buy a place, they're not jumping into some terrible situation. There's something called a bulk sales notice. This is the only time you're going to hear about this, and it's during the APA. You have to notify the State Department, the New York State Department of Sales Tax, to be specific, that this deal is happening. And the reason why is because if you're selling a business, and you owe the state some sales tax, they want their piece of the pie before anybody gets anything. Why is that? Because if you owe them money, you're holding the money for them. It's not your money. So any money you make, they're going to take first. So you have to get a release from the sales tax department before you can close a deal. Sometimes this gets people hung up. There's a liquor license transfer. Again, none of the words actually mean what they say they are. You're not transferring the license from one person to another. But because you have a liquor license in a place and you're selling a place, the buyer gets the advantage of that. You get to go to the community board. They treat you a lot nicer. We'll talk about that. And you get a license in a much faster time period. Instead of waiting 9 to 12 months, which is what it's taking now, believe it or not, you can get a temporary license in a couple of months. And then Also, anytime you're buying or selling a business, you have to understand that there's going to be a tax and lien search, meaning that a third-party company is going to look into the seller and make sure that they don't have any liens on the FF&E. You all know what that means. You have an SBA loan, for example, there's going to be a lien on the business that you have to clear up before you can sell. We all took SBA loans during COVID. So we're finding liens all over the place. If you owe a lot of money on an SBA loan, sometimes we can work it out with them. So don't let that keep you from selling your business. Okay. That's the jargon, folks. Now let's get Cosmo involved. The first thing we want to talk about is deciding whether or not it's worth your while to actually buy a business in a key money deal. Cosmo, what's the current inventory situation, and what do you generally feel about key money deals? Do you think it's a good deal for a buyer rather than going into a white box and building a place from scratch?
It depends what your needs are, how much capital you have, what neighborhood you're looking. And key money transactions in general are just an all-around complicated disaster for the most part, because the power shifts as the, let's say, seller of the business starts teeing up the transaction to transition. And you start, let's say, informing employees, you start winding down the business, you psychologically commit to making that sale. Once you put those wheels in motion, you lose a little bit of power in the negotiation.
We're going to talk about the shift in leverage because it's a
Yeah.
big part of it, and it's a big part of what we do as lawyers. We try to always determine where the leverage is in a deal. What's going on right now? What's the current inventory situation?
In I would say in the hot food and beverage corridors, there's an extreme demand for space and a super tight um, flow of inventory coming onto the market. So like, let's say, for instance, Upper East Side, let's say Second Avenue, prime retail corridor, Third, anywhere where a food and beverage operator would want to be, super duper tight market. West Village, super tight market. Nolita, like anywhere where you would actually want to be. So like, for instance, Grand assessment of the city, you'll get somebody, let's say they're driving around and they're like, oh, there's so many availabilities and there's so much vacant space. That's an indication way more so of random pockets that there's no demand for. Also, let's
So
say,
when you say, let's identify
yeah,
firstly, what the hot neighborhoods are. West Village, East Village. Tell me, just
West
give me your top
West Village,
seven.
Greenwich Village, super hot. East Village, I don't think hot at all. Chinatown starting to get a little hot. Upper East Side, strong market. Upper West Side, kind of. Midtown West has kind of died out. Midtown East kind of died out. Um, Areas I would say, like, let's say Midtown East and Midtown West, because it kind of relies on a combination of residential mixed in with office. So
Mhm,
it's and there's not much tourism, right? Like there's a theater crowd like West,
mhm.
but it's a little seedy. It hasn't really became what you would have thought, Hell's
What
Kitchen.
about Flatiron?
Flatiron, there's not a lot of like corridors, I would say. Like, let's say, Broadway, 23rd to well, let's say, yeah, okay, so Flatiron, opposed to Nomad. Let's say Fifth Avenue, and then little offshoots between like Gramercy, right? So like 22nd Street, 21st Street, Fifth Avenue. Fifth Avenue has a lot of larger spaces, so you can't really put, and it's priced a little bit higher than the threshold of where you kind of get priced out for food and beverage. So it's like you get a side street, or if you trend closer towards like Park Avenue South, it's not that in demand. If you were to say what's the strongest neighborhoods, West Village, Upper East Side, Nolita, Soho, let's just say.
So let's start at the start. I want to buy a restaurant. I have a couple of restaurants. I know I want to be in the West Village. You're
Mhm.
telling me that the market is tight. How do I go about finding space? Is it a matter of just contacting brokers? Are there pocket listings where people are not kind of advertising their spaces for sale? How do I find the space I'm looking for in a neighborhood that I want that I know is tight?
Call us. I would
And
say you have,
why is that? I know you're saying that half
yeah,
seriously, but why?
probably
Like,
whole seriously, like, because what happens is in these areas, you have to, there's a lot that goes into finding a space that, let's say, for instance, what a restaurant operator is doing is not trying to find a space. They're trying to find a space that has restaurant economics, right? So if there's, let's say we put into our database, I don't know, let's say realistically, uh, 20 new listings a day. Out of those 20 new listings, sometimes there's barely one that meets the criteria for a sustainable food and beverage deal, right? And maybe,
when you say, let me stop you there because you're
yeah.
saying some juicy things there, Cosmo. When you say restaurant economics, what do you mean? What are you referring to?
So you want to target like your occupancy costs uh, that make sense for the specific cuisine, right? So like steakhouse, can allow X amount of percentage towards occupancy costs, which is different than, let's say, a Sweetgreen or fast casual, whatever it is, right? So it's like, all
Right.
right, you have this location, you have this size, you have this amount of capex. Is the landlord sensitive to those needs? To what extent or what degree are they sensitive to those needs? So are they going to give you enough free time? If you need a liquor license, are they going to give you a contingency? If not, what are they giving you in lieu of a
Okay.
contingency?
Okay. We'll get into, I got you.
Yeah.
We'll get into some of that stuff. Tell me, so we know we have some tight market in in certain neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Um, what, because everyone asks this question first. What kind of prices are we looking at? What are key money deals going for? If you can give a range, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, they're not really, right? So like in the past, let's say you're selling your business based on uh an X factor, right? So it's like a multiple of your revenue. People don't usually sell a thriving, successful business where a multiple has anything to do with the purchase price. It's
Right.
basically how much term do you have left? Is your rent market under market? Like you're kind of selling a lease, right? And nowadays you're kind of, why key money deals have come back into play a little bit more so than they were drifting, almost to extinction, was uh, increase in labor, like construction, right? It's like it's expensive to build, and an increase in materials pricing, right? And availability of equipment and pricing. So it's like the construction process is is super expensive right now, and it's and
Mhm.
it's and it's burdensome, and it's a lot to deal with, right? So people are like, all right, you know what? Can I buy, a little crazy place that I can make, cosmetic or modest modifications, and get up and running, and make that that little algorithm make sense better. So it's like, all right, so what are you buying? You're buying a lease. That lease is relative to the term, and the rent. Like, is it under market? Is it at market? What are the increases? What happens when that transaction takes place, right? So when an assignment is made, there are certain triggers that also could change the economics, right? So they might say, okay, well,
We're gonna talk about
yeah.
assignment. We're gonna talk about economics, but
Yeah, so
I,
let's just say quickly for that, right? It could trigger, an increase of security. It could trigger a percentage increase of the rent, the base rent. So there,
we're gonna
yeah,
talk about all that stuff, Mr.
gotcha.
Cosmo.
See.
What are people asking? What's the range? Is it 250? Is it 250 to 500? Give me a range so our viewers understand what they're getting into.
It's basically what can you get base versus like what is the value in buying that particular establishment versus opening one with a new
What,
lease.
what kind of numbers are you seeing listed? I'm gonna, that,
Couple hundred thousand.
couple of hundred.
Yeah, let's say two. It depends. Like right now, we're working on, let's say, anything between, it could be like 200 to a million, let's say, on average,
Okay. Right.
which is a broad range. 1 million being much more rare than, the average two, three, four, five.
Gotcha. Thank you. That's what I was looking for. Uh, what, what,
My
yeah,
bad.
somebody's asking for a list of hot Brooklyn and Queens neighborhoods. I know you're a city guy. Do you know anything
I
about the
never heard of
boroughs?
those neighborhoods. No, I try to help people in Brooklyn and Queens. It's just difficult for us to service.
Okay, well, I'll
We
tell you what
we
I'm
don't
seeing.
know it
I'll
so
tell you
well.
what they are.
Yeah.
The hot neighborhoods in Brooklyn continue to be, first of all, my home neighborhood of Greenpoint is on fire. It's unstoppable. There's a new business opening, a new restaurant opening up every couple of days. Williamsburg continues to be hot. Cobble Hill and Brooklyn Heights and Borum Hill, not seeing all that much action there. We're seeing a lot in Ridgewood because
Mm.
the rents are low, and Rolo's really kind of put Ridgewood on the map when it comes to restaurants. Prospect Heights is getting some action, as is Bed-Stuy. That's what I'm seeing with the
Mm.
deals that are coming across my desk. So, okay, so it's a couple of $100,000, and when you're deciding to buy, how do you educate yourself? How many spaces do you think someone should look at before they find the right place?
Hmm. I don't know the answer to that. It's not really applicable to how I look at it. It's more so it's like understanding what your business, so everything's timing, right? So understanding what you need, like how many seats, what's your basic setup, what are you cooking, like what are you doing, liquor license, this, that, all your stuff. And then basically you just identify what you need and then pray that the market has that at this time. Right. Because it's
Yep.
like sometimes you could say, okay, I have this specific, need. There's nothing today. 2 weeks from now, there's three places, right?
Mhm.
So it's more so like identify what you need in interpersonally, right? Um, Commit to that. Start just taking, the steps in doing your search, just, maybe cruise around to different neighborhoods, make phone calls, whatever. And then get prepared, like as prepared as possible. So like, if you need to line up or raise capital, right? So like start working on that, have that as close, to available as possible. Start speaking to your contractors or designers and like have your
Let's
people.
talk about that for a second,
Yeah.
because I hear what you're saying. You have to know what you want, and then you're really out there looking for that. It might be the first place, it might be the 10th place. If you're a seasoned operator, you'll know immediately
Yeah.
what it is. If you're a first timer, you might need to look at a couple. When
And
did
and
you
and be prepared. Like have your stuff ready so that if when it does pop up, there's going to be 10 other people that are bidding on that same property.
Right. So you got to have your money ready. You have to have your lawyers in place. You have to have
Yeah.
everything ready to go so you can seize the opportunity, because a hot place will last a minute. Um, when you bring in your GC, which is a really important step, because the whole reason for the key money deal is to save yourself some money, but you don't want to walk into a rat's nest of issues. So what does a typical inspection look like? You've been through some GC inspections. I've had some guy, some clients call their friends and they spend a half an hour, they have a coffee and they say, the place looks great. And then there's, structural issues in the basement and the joists are all messed up and it costs them
Mhm.
$100,000 to fix. Have you been through a GC inspection, a thorough one? And can you explain what that looks like?
Yeah, I've been through probably thousands of them, and how you have to think about the role that each person plays, right? So contractors' job is twofold. It's one to identify potential problems, right? And offer solutions. It's also their job to make as much money as they can per job, right? So they make up shit, and you're not necessarily able to determine if their way of handling the problem or solving or creating a solution or addressing a concern is the right way, the least expensive way. There's
Tell
a
me
lot of
what,
things.
take me through a thorough process. GC shows up, how you
Yeah.
doing? He comes in, tell me what's he doing?
Let's say they look at the let's say exhaust, and it's kind of to code, right? Or certain things that are just like it's a gray area sometimes. Like let's say a place that's doing some sort of light cooking and heating food. That's let's say by codes requires, I don't know, let's say a type one or let's say requires a type two, and they just have like exhausted something, or like there's always like a corner cut. And then it's like, all right, well, how do we resolve this? Is it worth resolving it? What's the risk? Like all these different things. And then the contractor sometimes just completely miss what's going on. Like there's been
Take
times
me,
where,
I understand
yeah.
that they miss stuff. Let's, let's go into the imaginary world for a
Hmm.
second and take me through, if you can, what a thorough GC inspection would look like. Not what they do, not what they fuck up,
Yeah, I
but what do
understand what
they
you're saying.
actually do? So he
Thorough,
comes in the door
thorough
and
is the
what
wrong
are they
word.
doing?
Appropriate inspection.
Okay,
Right? So
appropriate.
an appropriate inspection would take into consider all factors, right? And you have to have the right contractor that knows how to do it. So for instance, the right bid for the job, the right price, to stay within budget, to stay within scope, like let's say like of the project, right? Not just in budget, but like scope of like what are we actually trying to achieve here, and how do we achieve it? Um, you have to have a contractor that really knows what they're doing. So at some point in my career, I had to go find guys that I know that know like how to understand the entire uh, project and
What are
the
the big
different
things?
levers and
Cosmo,
triggers.
I want to move on.
Yeah.
I want to move on from this. So maybe I can ask a more pointed question.
Yep.
What are the top three things that a contractor needs to look for?
The budget. What are we working with first?
Okay,
Right? How much do you have to spend on, this? That's
right.
the most important thing because,
Okay.
if the space
Who's
doesn't
looking at
work,
the kitchen and making sure that it's up to code? Is that the contractor or is that an architect?
usually the it depends. Your kitchen architect. It depends if the restaurateur is knowledgeable, they might, or a chef, they might know,
Okay,
themselves. So not
okay.
not kitchen is a little bit more um specialized than just a general contractor, but sometimes the contractor knows.
All right. Let's talk about raising money because you mentioned that hot places go quickly.
Hmm.
And so one of our attendees has asked, when should you raise money in the process? I will answer that and say, the moment you know you want to open up another restaurant and you're looking, you should be raising money because you're going to find something. If you don't find the perfect key money deal, maybe you'll find an empty space, but you should start raising money immediately, the moment you know that you want to open up another place. Let's
Yeah.
talk a little bit
Can I
more
say, I
about,
want to say one thing about that.
yeah,
I wouldn't say that the places go quickly. It's that there's a tremendous amount of demand for good spaces, right? So it
mhm,
doesn't necessarily equate to who's the fastest at all. It's like who's the fastest 15 people, right? And then those 15 people are basically competing for the space and they get weeded out, right? And then it's like then you're left with who's the best, right? So because sometimes I feel like people that have, let's say, one or two locations where it's their first venture and they're like, all right, we got to go quick, and they have that thing like good places go fast and all that, and they're not getting that. You could go as fast as you want. Some people, you're never going to get a space in in the context of like like let's say West Village, it's very difficult because every time a space in the West Village comes available, you're competing against a lot of people that have, you know, very successful restaurants and enterprises and, you know, multi-unit operators that have, you know, press and know what the hell they're doing. So it's like you have two locations or one location, no locations. It's not about just being fast, right? So if you're raising money, right? And starting that process, like kind of get everything together. Like if you have a concept, create a website, create you know a brand deck, this that, have it so that even though you have no locations or one or two locations, you look because basically who's your first customer? It's the landlord, right? The landlord has to buy your
Mm.
shit first, or you're not selling your product to anybody else, right? So number one, most important, first customer, landlord. Sell your shit to the landlord first, and then you'll have a chance to sell your stuff to everybody
Good
else.
point. That's a good point because the landlord's got to approve you.
Hmm.
In every lease, no matter what, the landlord's going to have approval rights over who's coming in. So that's makes a lot of sense. Have a business plan together, have a deck together, let the landlord know what you're planning on doing there so that you can appease them and give them some comfort to know that they're getting a better tenant than the one who's probably going out of business. Um, let's talk about some other pros of purchasing a business in a key money deal. One thing is, we all know this, it's less expensive usually than a full build out. Um, we have the liquor license transfer. So this gives you some predictability. When you're doing a key money deal, you kind of know, like once I close and I get through the community board, I can open when I'm ready, not the other way around when it's a full build out on a blank space and you don't know when you're getting Con Ed to come by or inspections and other stuff. So predictability also saves us money. It keeps us from having unnecessary delays. Um, this community boards are friendlier typically to transfers of liquor licenses. Anybody who's done business in the city knows that community boards 1, 2, and 3, Brooklyn Community Board 1 and 2, can be very, very stringent and very difficult. And you might have to go back a couple of times if you're trying to open up a new space and get a new liquor license. But when you're doing a transfer, they tend to go a lot easier on you and make the process a lot smoother. So that's another pro of buying, especially in CBs 1, 2, and 3, which is downtown. Um, let's talk about some of the cons of buying. So one of the big cons of buying is you're stuck with certain design flaws potentially that you may just inherit. And you're not really buying your dream space. You're buying someone else's build out. Now you can go in and do a full demo. That's fine, but that kind of defeats the purpose. In a lot of these places, though, Cosmo, I'm sure you're seeing people doing full demos because the lease is worth it, because that is the most valuable asset that they're buying. Is that true? Is that what you're finding?
Yeah, it's always, I would say it's always advantageous to, if you find a key money deal, it always winds up being a better scenario. It's just a lot more difficult to find a place that's being sold that meets the requirements for your business, right? So it's like if
Mhm.
you find one and it does, then it's a way better situation, right? Because there's like you said, there's way more certainty, there's way less risk, right? You have an operating business that requires a lot less. There's a lot less risk in that you're going to discover something that can hurt you, right? The unseen or intangible risk. It's pretty straightforward. The lease is in place. They may, like you said, they modify it basic modifications, usually to the, economics, the term. And then the APA allows you to predictably, go through the process of getting the liquor license. It's hard for the community board, to oppose it. So in every way, shape, or form, a key money transaction outside of the one lever of the transition, and if however you look at that, besides that, I would say it's ideal, right? It's just, is there something that's currently available that meets the requirements of
Do you
what
see,
you're looking
do you,
for?
do you see your clients taking over spaces and doing full demos?
you wouldn't usually do that, right? So like if the point of a key money deal is to not do a complete overhaul. Like it wouldn't really make sense, right? Like you would rather start with if you're going to spend money like that, you might as well just start with a clean slate, right? And not have to repair, a faulty knee. It's like start from scratch, But
Well, what if it's on a perfect location, in the West Village, it's in a corner spot, and you know that the lease is, I don't know, 15% under market.
that wouldn't happen.
Doesn't happen.
No.
There's no under market leases in hot spots.
Mm, it just doesn't work like that, right? Like everything is pretty much predictable with the marketplace. Like everything makes sense. There's
Mhm.
not all of a sudden like that doesn't make sense. Like that's crazy. Like whatever. Like everything makes sense. If there's a space here, it's this price, it's these terms. The landlord's this much of a pain in the butt.
And no one gets the
It,
deal of the century. Is that what you're saying? And no one
no,
gets
it's
screwed
it's
too badly
a
or
deal.
good.
A deal. It's not the deal of the century. It's the deal personally, right? You specifically, that deal specifically good for you, for your specific reason, right?
Right.
Like not generally speaking. It's personal, right? Like this lays out exactly, the way that I need it to lay out. This is, the exactly how I want my outdoor seating to be. This is, the vibe of, the little crazy place that I want and a little social club or so like there's always like a specific driver like a
Right.
personal driver that
Got you.
that makes that match.
Got you. Here's a question. If you're selling, do you always need to include your existing equipment in key money deals? That's a question from one of our viewers.
Yeah, usually you like as the seller,
Yeah.
yeah, like what are you gonna do with it? It's like I don't know. You're gonna sell a car and keep the tires, like you sell the equipment and you move on. Like and like unless you're making a sale to somebody that like because let's say the equipment is specific to that layout, right? So it's like you have X amount of pieces of equipment that's under, that size hood. And then it's like, unless somebody's like, listen, like, I don't need any of that stuff. And, we're going to buy all new stuff. And if you want to take it, then take it. Maybe, you know, put it to use somewhere else. But, for the most part, you just want to get rid of, whatever's there and move on.
Here's another question I hear all the time. Um, and I'd like your take on it. Do you believe in such thing as a cursed location? Meaning a
No,
location that
yeah, I'm
has
trying. Yeah,
had,
I understand
well, I
what the
just want
question.
to explain it to the people who are listening. Meaning
No,
a locate,
it's,
hang on one second.
yeah,
This location means a location that has, a constant flow of new tenants. People come in, they go out. Oh, that looked like a good concept. They last 6 months and no one can make it in this
yeah.
space.
I was trying to figure out how to say it. So what a cursed location actually really is uh, a, usually, right, a location that's in a market that is predominantly overvalued, right? So let's say I used to say all the time, I live on the Upper West Side, that the Upper West Side was one of the most overvalued markets because everyone that lives on the Upper West used to, this is pre-COVID. Now it's a completely different market, I think, but everyone that lived there goes downtown, to work. They're not home, right? So they're pricing, spaces on, let's say, Columbus or, certain parts of Amsterdam at these rents as if there's people that are in that neighborhood during the
Right.
day and there
And
weren't.
it's crickets.
Yeah, so it's like you have no business during, people order in. Like I live there, I know lots of people in the neighborhood, right? Like I know how the pattern is, and it just didn't make sense. But now that people are there, but anyway, so what happens is that they're like, oh, this is a good neighborhood. This is by the museum. There's lots of income in the area, and the landlord winds up being tough, never giving into the marketplace, right? So it's a pretty good location, and there's a lot of people that are bidding on it. The landlord winds up always taking the person that's willing to pay the most, right? And it's usually somebody that it's a newer restaurant operator, right? That's willing to jump because it's not their money, right? So it's like they have an investor that before that money dries up, they have to jump where the money's gone. So the landlord's pushing and a bunch of people are bidding, and that landlord's willing to take somebody that shouldn't normally get the space because they're willing to jump the highest. And that's the landlord's mentality that he continually, deploys.
So
And
the,
uh, and
so the landlord is putting the curse on the space because they're greedy.
not because they're greedy, because they don't know how to calculate sustainability.
They don't know how to vet a good tenant.
No, they just don't know how to, because a landlord's business model is opposite a tenant's business model, right? Landlord buys an income, right? Their goal is to get as much money as they can from that space. Tenant is to, acquisition a space where they can, sell their stuff, and their goal is to at least create as much as they can to lock down the one fixed cost that they have, right? Keep your occupancy cost in check, while everything else is going nuts, your labor and your food costs are going wild. At least like we know these are our occupancy costs, right? And they're going along with inflation, whatever. So they're opposed to each other in theory, right? And then everyone loves greedy landlord, and I think it's such a ridiculous uh, way to think, because the landlord is not your enemy, right? And if you try to make the landlord your friend, I don't know how far that's going to get you, but you have to understand that that person paid and a lot of money to own that building and own a lot of buildings, and they're not going to be pushed around
Okay.
by somebody. But wait,
There's only so much pro landlord talk that I can put up with on this,
well,
particular
I just wanted to get to
I
the,
hear you. I
yeah.
hear what you're saying. Okay. All right. So let's move on, because we know landlords need to make money. We know that, um, they buy a property, and of course, if they're not making money, they're gonna go out of business.
Can I
Uh,
close that out real quick? Because I
sure.
gathered my thoughts.
Let's close it out.
All right. So ultimately, um, the landlord is unaware of how to find balance and sustainability with the tenant. So the space becomes jinxed, right? And our job, or my job, maybe sometimes your job, is we have to just inform the landlord, let's say for these jinxed spaces, right? Try to provide as much information as possible and say, listen, like, the last three tenants went out of business, right? And here's why. And in order for this space to be successful and sustainable, um, this is the reason why you need to, charge X amount of rent and, these certain terms, and
Yeah.
try to explain it. And then you could create a previously jinxed space into something that's, good.
I'm gonna ask you one question. Either you know the answer or you don't. Can you give me an example of a space that was jinxed that has turned it around?
Jinxed space. Um, offhand,
I'll give you an example.
I'm
Um,
not sure what their revenue is right now, but I think it's called, doesn't make sense because I don't really even remember the name of it, but it's this place Taka. It was I all forgetting everything, so I forget what I'm gonna say.
there's a space on Lorimer Street, across from, it's across from the park. It was a bunch of different things. Ray's took it over, and now they're doing really well. That place was a ton of spaces. It was in a great spot. And it's across from Five Leaves, and now it's doing well. Oh, look, people who are on our podcast or on our, sorry, webinar. Noan at East Village, Jay Lee turned around that space. Kimi Ka on Kenmare and Elizabeth, multiple failed tenants doing well now. Thank you for all. If anybody has any others, I'd love to hear them. I'm going to move on to the next topic, which is deciding to sell. It's always a big decision, and I want people to understand what should go into the decision and also how it works. So the first question you have to ask yourself, and this is, of course, after you've decided that your space isn't working and your business isn't working. You know how to do that. I'm not going to tell you how to do that. the first thing to do is to look at your lease. It's the lease, it's the lease, it's the lease. And you have to ask the question of how much time you have left, and will the landlord extend the lease at a reasonable rent? So you have to ask, and Cosmo, we have to ask our question, how long is long enough left where a buyer would buy the lease and not have to go back to the landlord and ask for an extension? Is 7 years the number? Is 8 years the number? Does it have to be 10?
It's hard to say. I think if you're contemplating selling your place, you should definitely talk to the landlord first
Mhm.
and see if they're open. Because sometimes they will be. I feel like a lot of times the landlord would be open to extending the lease if they know that you're not doing well, because then they're going to be exposed to reletting the space. They have the idea sometimes that they're going to get more money for it, but it depends. They have to absorb free time to the new tenant, uncertainty with the liquor license potentially,
Well, not
and
always. Let me step in there. Oftentimes with oh yes, if you're talking about it, right, you're talking about a new lease. With an assignment, we very rarely get free rent.
yeah, no, I'm saying like
Yeah,
why a
if they
landlord
put
would
it on
be
the market.
yeah more willing to so they're like, all right, well, if they're faced with would we be willing to add a little bit more term to your lease to not have to deal with all that stuff, and you're going to find a new tenant, line it up for us, and we're not exposed to all these costs, then they'd usually be amenable to it, right? Especially if you're not doing well. It's like kind of like throwing you a bone. You're like, listen, I don't want this guy to get hurt. You get to recoup your security deposit, and get to walk away with salvaging something from your investment. So usually the landlords will cooperate with you and be open to it. They might not commit to it, but they might say, okay, in theory, we'll potentially be willing to give you a little bit more term or whatever it
Well,
is.
let's say we have 5 years left and no
Yeah.
buyer's going to take over a lease with 5 years left. So we go to the landlord and we have to have a conversation. Tell me how to have that conversation. What are we actually saying to the landlord? Are we saying, look, this business isn't working and I've going to put it on the market. There's 5 years left, and I'd like to make sure from you that I can extend it, or the new tenant can extend it to 10. What other questions are we asking the landlord during that conversation? Because it's not an easy conversation.
Yeah. I would say I'm half joking when I say this, but I would start paying your rent a little bit late. Uh, I'm kidding, but I'm not. Like, you need to create, I don't know how to do it. That way is joking, but you need to like make it real that you're not going to be staying and you're
Hmm.
not, sustaining that, so however you need to communicate that, that needs to be communicated. Maybe it's through a meeting, maybe you are late on your rent. I don't know, but it has to be made real, right? Because a
So you're
landlord's
saying
not.
it's not, you're saying it's not real until the landlord feels a little pain?
No, it's just like it's not real until it's actually real. So it's like, what is real, right? What's real?
That's
The real is like it
that's
needs to
that's
be. It's
that's
gonna
some
need to
deep
be
shit.
done.
That's some deep shit, Cosmo. I don't, I don't know if I can
It's
answer
gonna
that
it,
one.
real means it's gonna need to be dealt with, like actually gonna need to be dealt with, right? So, however that's communicated that it really needs to be dealt with is, you
Take
have
me
to pay.
through a conversation. I'm the landlord. You're a
Yeah,
tenant. You said, "Hey, David, I want to talk to you. I got something to talk to you about."
yeah.
What are you saying to me?
We're having a really, really, really hard time making it.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it's not looking good. I'm struggling to piece together the rent, right? I don't know how I'm gonna pay my employees. I'm completely screwed and I need to get out like ASAP. Uh, I'm working on some potential, buyers, but there's, I only got 4 years left. Are you able, where we could work together so you don't get hit with broker's fees and free time and all that? Like, if I find somebody, could you give them a little bit more term? Like, let's say in theory,
Okay. Yeah,
because
sure.
otherwise I'm not going to be able to sell it. You're going to get the space back. I'm ripping everything out of here because, some of this stuff is uh leased. right? I don't even own half the shit. Even if you do, you don't own it. Well, who knows? And I need your help. And then a lot of times the landlord's like, all right, what do we need to do? Like, this is, exhausting listening to you. Like, let's solve it.
Are
Throw a
you
couple more years on
asking,
a lease. Fine.
are you also, so let's use the same example. You've got 5 years left and the landlord says, sure, I can extend it to 5. Are you also asking the landlord what that rent would be? So when you market it, you can tell a potential buyer slash tenant what they'll be paying for those extra 5 years?
Yeah, it should be 3% increases, right? So the landlord might say, listen, I'll give them an extra 5 if you bump it, 10%, or sometimes it's in the lease, right? It'll say if there's an assignment, the lease, the rent increases by 10%, right? Or whatever it is. So it'll usually be spelled out. Like, I think the landlord will have a good sense of if you're getting a deal or not, right? You'll know, the market will know, everybody will know, where that rent stands, based on it's usually connected to your the amount of seats that you have, right? Like, how many seats do you have? Like, what's the flow? How many people can you fit in there? What are your steps? Like, all this stuff. Like, everyone in the business knows exactly kind of if something's worth whatever it is or not, right? It's
Okay,
kind of like
so
everybody knows.
so you go to the landlord. Landlord says, okay, no problem. I'll extend it to 10. Here's what the rent's going to be. I'm going to jack it up 10% in after the first 5 years, and then we'll go back to 3. Then you can actually go to market with that and you can put it on the market. Is that right? Once you know what the lease terms are going to be.
Yeah, keep in mind also that there is no putting on the market when there's a key money deal, right? Because it's a funny transaction. You can't alert the staff, so you don't put it on the market. It's just basically like you get your, marching orders, right? Like, instead of putting on the market, you get marching orders, and then you make your phone calls, right? So it's like with us, we'll call, all of our clients are
Wait,
pretty
wait,
much our.
stop there. When you say you're not putting on the market, what you're doing is you're calling a broker and you're telling them to use their channels to see if they can find a buyer, right?
100%, exactly.
Okay, right. How long are you seeing deals take these days? Because timing matters. We're operating a restaurant. We're not doing well. We're still paying rent. We still have staff. We're still open. Um, 2 questions. The first question is, how much leverage do you lose when you close a restaurant and then put it on the market? Second question is, how long are deals taking from, let's say, signed LOI to actually closing?
Yeah. So you're not going to close and put it on the market. You're going to, like you said, reach out to a broker for them to use their connections to try to find you a buyer while you're operating. Once you close, you're dead. Like, from when you close, you're just paying money that you didn't even have to stay open, right? So you might as well just give the space back. But you're operating at a break even, or you're not making enough to support the amount of energy and effort that you're putting into the place, right? And you just want it off the table. You might have opened something else, where you want to dedicate your energy full force to that and not deal with,
Okay, so you want to stay open,
yeah,
number one. And then how long is it taking from LOI, yay, we got a deal, we all agree,
yeah.
to now I'm done, I've got my money, I'm off to the next thing?
Depends who's involved. The community board adds a variable, right? So it's like, do they reject you, community board? Do they accept you? Like, what community board are you in? Who are you dealing with? Who's the attorneys, right? The attorneys, you guys are fast, right? Like, we can knock stuff out pretty quickly together, because everyone knows exactly what they're doing and what needs to get done, right? So that saves time. So it depends who's involved. There's retrades, which I mentioned in the beginning. Like, you got to be careful for retrades if you wind down your business. And then, from a business perspective, you could say, oh, well, if somebody retrades, like, that's super messed up, morally, that like, we agreed to this number, and now you're like changing terms, like, as I'm winding down the business, ready to make the sale. But then other people see it as, that's business. Like, you lost leverage, you're winding down, makes your place worth less because I know you need to get out more, so there's like a lot of different weird things that are happening. Uh, so I would say it's subject to a lot of different variables that are unpredictable. But let's say, generally speaking, maybe, I don't know, 2 months, 3 months.
I was gonna say what we're seeing is 2 to 4 months.
Yeah,
From signed LOI to actually
yeah.
at the closing table, checks being exchanged, um, moving on to the next venture. So when do you, and this is another question that I field all the time. When do you think you're better off triggering your good guy notice with the landlord rather than putting it on the market?
Tricky. The good guy guarantee is tricky because it like what even like let's say if you want to go philosophically, what even is, what is a good guy guarantee? Who's the good guy in a good guy guarantee? Right? There's no good guys. Um, it's a bad guy guarantee, right? Or a bad business guarantee. So what's it meant for? Is it meant for is it a lever for the landlord to be able to get you out of this space because you're not paying rent? Because technically you're not allowed to exercise it if you're in default,
Correct?
right? But who is like, oh, you know what? I don't think I'm going to be able to survive, the next couple, this winter. So rather than try, I'm just going to throw in the towel on my $5 million investment. Right. So that never happens. It's, you're in arrears 2, 3, 4 months rent, right? You call the landlord's like, dude, like you can't leave. You're on the hook personally for, you can't even exercise the good guy, if you're in default. So like, call me when you're up to date. And he's like, I'm not calling you when I'm up to date. I need to get out of here. Like, we need to work something out. So it's kind of like a lever for both sides. And how it plays out in reality in terms of like, if it gets litigious and, are you able to even collect the money from, a defaulting tenant? The whole thing is weird, right? So it's kind of just like, all right, um, when do you decide to sell your business? When you've lost hope, right? And you're like, I
No,
need
no,
to.
that might be the case, and there is another way out that we've been using. We have a bankruptcy attorney that we work with. Oftentimes, when tenants are very, I don't know, when they're in arrears so much that they can't kind of buy their way out of it and trigger the good guy, we go to bankruptcy. And landlords don't like to hear from bankruptcy lawyers. They get very nervous because bankruptcy lawyers can keep you in the space for a long time. You're not paying rent, and ultimately you end up working out a deal. So that is kind of the nuclear option, but we have actually been seeing it save a lot of our clients. I have a question from one of our viewers. You ready, Cosmo?
Mhm.
Often you see restaurants in good locations that closed during the pandemic, and the landlords are still not really negotiating. Is there any upside or benefit to the landlord to staying closed and not receiving rent? I was negotiating with the landlord who was standing strong on a price, saying he had others in line. 1 year later, it's still sitting there. What's the logic behind that?
Logic is the the term of the commitment, right? So if you commit to, let's say, getting less than you want or less than you feel a space is worth, you're making that commitment for 10 to 15 years, right? So in the moment, if let's say a space is worth, $50,000 a month, and that's what the landlord thinks it's worth, and that's what, he's convinced. And you get an offer for, 40,000, and he's got to commit now to losing, whatever it is, 100 and something $1,000 a year difference for the
For 10
next,
years.
yeah, 10 years, 15 years, right? And you have to understand the nature of like like what is a landlord? It's not like a person, like an individual person. A landlord is like a mindset, right? So it's like that landlord that did whatever he needed to do to own, this, very expensive building and deal with tenants complaining and this and that. It's like at the end of the day, it's like they're not going to be bullied or pressured, for, a space in their building by, a tenant or a broker, right? So they're like, who are you? It's my building. I can do what I want, right? And then next thing you know, they made a miscalculation, or it was a mistake. Their information in their mind, which led them to, determine a market value, or, their specific needs, and whatever. Ultimately, at the end, it's like, when you invest in the stock market, sometimes you're a genius and sometimes you're absolutely like, the least smartest person in the world. It's just, it winds up sometimes that doesn't equate to,
Okay,
what they hoped.
so the logic is that landlords have a number that they need to hit, and they're willing to wait for it to see if the market turns around.
Yeah, like usually that's an instance where a landlord can afford to get their number. Like you'll hear it where they'll say, if that's what my space is worth, then I'd rather sit vacant. It's a flex. It's there's no benefit to it. You're losing income, right? But it's just like some people, they have enough, money where they can do that. They're just like, it is what it is. If that's what I got to do, then nobody's getting this space and I can afford it. So the cost
Mhm.
goes to me, let the market, do whatever they want with somebody else's property. And it's usually because they can afford it, not because it
So-
benefits them.
Heard. Let's talk about and kind of wrap up the pros of selling. First of all, you get to recoup your money, and here's how you should look at the money. You're going to get your purchase price. You can add to the purchase price your security deposit. The landlord's going to keep the security deposit, but the buyer is going to reimburse you because they're going to keep it on account. So you get a purchase price, you get your security deposit, and then you have to deduct a broker commission. And what is that typically, Cosmo, percentage wise?
Depends how small or how big, but usually it's 10% with a minimum, based on like how low the key money is.
So deduct your broker commission, 10%, deduct your landlord fees. In every lease, you're going to see fees that say for an assignment, you have to pay the landlord up to a couple $1,000. You have your rent and operating losses potentially. So you have to do a little math to figure out if it's worth it to actually sell. Um, let's talk about the landlord a little more, Cosmo. I know you love landlords. First of all, we need the landlord here. Here is where you have to turn on the charm and be friends with the landlord. So we're going to review our assignment clause first. Every lease has a clause that says when and how you can assign the lease. If it's a good clause, it will say that the landlord cannot unreasonably withhold his consent, meaning that if you bring somebody to the landlord that's a good tenant, the landlord can't say no. Those are most of them. Sometimes, though, the landlord has full full consent. He can be as unreasonable as he wants, and that gives the landlord a ton of leverage. And what do they do with that leverage? Well, I've seen landlords say, you know what? I'm not approving anybody unless you give me a cut of the purchase price. I've also seen leases where if there is an asset sale, the landlord automatically gets to participate in the purchase price up to sometimes 50%. Don't ask me why they do this. I fought with landlords for years over this. I find it to be very greedy, but if it's in the lease, they're going to take their money. So you got to look into your lease and make sure that's not the case. When you present a new tenant or potential tenant, Cosmo, to a landlord during this process, and you're looking for consent, a lot of times the landlord will say, well, I want to check the tenant's credit, or I want to make sure that the tenant is worthy. What on earth are they actually looking for? Are they just doing like, do they want to see bank accounts? Are they looking at credit scores? What goes through a landlord's mind when they're deciding whether or not a new tenant's going to make it?
Yeah. So very, very surprisingly, very rarely are landlords ever doing credit checks. It's more the health of the business, or group that's coming in. So like let's say for instance there's you have an offer from someone, they're going to want to see some sort of equivalent of, let's say, proof of funds, right? So it's like where do they have money? Where is the money? Do they have money like enough to for this new project.
Is
Right,
there,
so it's like,
is there, well, hold on, because that's a big one. Do they have money?
yeah,
Money for what? How much money?
relative to the estimate of project cost.
That's what they care about. So if the key money, let's say, is 250 and I've got 500 and I show the landlord 500, is that enough?
If it's a little crazy place, yeah, like let's say if it's a, you know, a 1,200 square foot wine bar, right, or whatever it is, like it's relative to what they're actually buying, right? So it's like if it's 2,500 square feet over 2,500 square foot and the rent's 25,000, you know, and it's like, all right, the amount of work, like the land, like it was recently renovated, whatever. It's just a calculation, right? If we're gonna do if you're gonna do a coffee shop, right? And you got 100 grand in an account, like, you know, that's probably fine. Like, it's just a vibe, right? And same with financials, right? It's like, you know, you're supposed to have income to be able to cover, you know, to some degree, your rent if your business isn't able to pay for it, right? Because your good guy guarantee is usually a performance guarantee in full, right? Until it's exercised. So, you know, let's say you're making 150,000 a year, you know, or $3 million a year, whatever it is, it's all relative to what you're actually doing, right? And keep in mind too, like, you know, there's monies, you know, when you're an entrepreneur, um, you're not necessarily, you know, landing at what you're paying taxes on, you know, what you actually made, right? Like, you know, you could make $2 million and it's like, but you know, there's monies coming out of the business for, you know, stuff that for a W-2 worker would be, you know, out of their personal pocket,
Okay.
you
All
know, that
right.
the business pays for.
So every landlord's got their own kind of, I don't know, wants and
Sense,
needs when it comes
sense.
to and sense of a person, but they're going to ask for certain things. What another question we hear all the time, because and understandably, sellers are reluctant to introduce a potential buyer to a landlord too early in the process. When do you think is the right moment? Is it once an LOI is signed that you introduce a potential buyer to the landlord, or before that?
I don't think usually not at all, right? There's no real need to make that connection until that's like you're basically very close to transacting, right? Like, you know, because
Well,
what
signed LOI.
way beyond that, I would say, like LOI. That's another thing. Like when you say signed LOI, like some people like to sign LOIs. Like a signed LOI doesn't mean anything, really. Like, are you like like a signed
Okay,
LOI? Like we're in
so
agreement on
maybe
economics.
so maybe what you're saying is when a contract is signed and a deposit is given.
Yeah. No,
Okay.
yeah, like let's say right around there where it's like where you're very close to the next step being um uh the landlord's cooperation and participation in your application for your permits, right? So it's like when we're about to have to interact with the landlord, that's kind of close to when you should start making that connection, warming that connection up a little bit.
Good point. And when you're a buyer and you're thinking about the lease, here are some things that you should think about. Because what you're going to do is you're going to get the existing lease from the seller earlier on in the process, well before you meet the landlord, and you need to review that lease. Oftentimes, that lease is going to be non-negotiable. So here are some things to look at least some big ticket items. You need to understand, obviously, how long is left on the lease, what's the term. You need to understand what yearly rent escalations are and anything that's additional rent. These are things like taxes, sometimes CAM charges, sometimes water bills. We've seen clients get really screwed on this by not asking and finding out what those are every year. It's just another form of rent, and that can
Hmm.
really put you in the hole. You want to understand what the default provisions are in the lease, meaning if you don't do certain things, when can the landlord terminate the lease? And you want to make sure that they're not too harsh. Again, this is something an attorney should be looking at for you. And of course, the assignment clause, which you're dealing with now. Anything else, Cosmo, that you think is super important when you're looking at that lease as a buyer?
I think you nailed it. Default provisions and probably the number one most important thing is like additional rent, meaning or more most heavily weighted on your real estate tax, uh, the amount that has accrued over paying your increases for X amount of years. So it's like 5 years down the road, what is your real estate tax amount due at that point of the lease, right? Because
Right.
it's usually the most impactful part of the additional charges. And like you said, like what percentage of the water bill, if it's the sub meter or whatever, this, that, like just getting a grip on like what are your total additional costs.
And some other buyer due diligence, if you're buying a place, here are some things to know just right off the bat. We're going to do a tax and lien search, like we said before. We're going to make sure, and you can ask the seller these questions. Hey, you have any liens on your FF&E? Right from the outset. Do you owe any sales tax? Something
Mhm.
else you're going to want to know. Do you have any outstanding SBA loans? Are you in arrears? These are things you want to know as a buyer. Do you have any SLA steps? So if a buyer's open till 12 o'clock, sorry, a place is open till 12 o'clock, and you as a buyer want to be open till 2, and the current place has a stipulation with the community board that says we have to close at 12, you want to know that, because that might make the road a little more difficult. And you also want to know if there's any pending lawsuits, because that could come back to bite you. Here's a question from one of our viewers. How does someone calculate selling a lease? How many years left times what? What other factors add money to the sale, like liquor license? Also, what is the current algorithm for selling a concept with 2 or 3 units, but has built a brand? So what is the brand number? How do we value it?
I think none of that's not really how it gets calculated.
Mhm.
So it's basically how much would it cost to reproduce that space with a new lease in a in somewhere else, right? So that's kind of it. So the value is like we mentioned earlier, the ability to the transfer through an APA, right? And the certainty of getting that liquor license, right? Because the place is operating.
Right.
That saves you time and it creates certainty and it has a value. What's the value? You could put it on a spreadsheet and probably figure it out. But that's that. Then you have you know, a place that's in place. So, what would it cost to whatever you're saving, right? It's like you could keep the bar and, this general layout works for you, whatever. So it's like if the space isn't like a good fit specific to what you plan on doing with it, right? Or meets, your thoughts on, how you want to develop the space aesthetically, then it's like that's where the value is. So it's like, all right, this has a value to me because that's literally how I was going to lay out my new place.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's like so then all those values or all that savings is translated into a value for the key money, right? So that's why it's tricky. It's like if you're selling your place, well, what can I get? What can you get?
Well, there's a
Depends who
difference.
wants it.
There's there's a big difference between selling a place and selling a brand. Um, so we do have webinars about selling a brand and how to figure that out. And viewer, if you want to hit me up offline, I can talk to you about that. It's a very different concept because when you're selling a brand, you're also selling the existing businesses. So
Yeah.
people come in and they want to take them over. It's very different than a key money deal. I'm going to now roll through what an APA life cycle is, and then we're going to take some questions just so everybody understands. Number one, this is for a seller. Do a financial analysis and decide whether or not you should be triggering the good guy, or if you want to sell 9 out of 10 times, you're going to want to sell. Number two, contact the landlord. Talk to them, like Cosmo said, about what you got left on the lease, what you can go out there to market with, how long and how much. That's what everybody's going to want to know. Number three, call some brokers, set a price. A broker will come by, they'll tell you a realistic price, and then they'll jack that up a bit so that it can come down and there's a little negotiating room. Put it on the market, meaning the broker's going to put it on the market. You're not putting it out there for everybody to see, and show it quietly. Brokers will bring people by at times when you think are acceptable, and they'll show them the space. Then once you have a buyer who's interested, you agree on terms with the buyer. We draft and negotiate an LOI. Once that's signed, we go to contract. Contract is an APA. The APA is signed and the buyer puts a 10% of the purchase price into escrow. At that point, we usually introduce the buyer to the landlord. Then we're going to the community board to get approval for the transfer, making sure all outstanding loans and debts and liens are taken care of. Once we complete the lease negotiations, and once we have approval from the community board, we go to closing. And then you're done. And that, my friends, is the life cycle of an APA. And now we have time, and thank you, Cosmo, for your insight. And I really do appreciate your, helping us understand where a landlord's coming from. I know I joke a lot about landlords. I have a lot of landlord friends. I don't hate landlords, but I fight with them all the time. But it's good to know where they're coming from, so we know how to handle them, and we know what their sore spots are. So we have some time for some questions. If anybody wants to put them into the chat box, we're happy to answer them. We'll stick around. We've gotten some great questions so far. Cosmo, is there anything else you want to add before we answer some questions and sign off?
No,
No? That's it?
that's it.
Somebody with so much to say, now you're done? You've let it all out?
I'm exhausted now.
You're exhausted. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for stopping by. Appreciate it. When's our next webinar, Alex, and what is it? Oh, it's next month. We have a question. What are the scenarios when a profitable business is willing to sell? Have you ever seen somebody, Cosmo,
Yeah,
making money and they're like, I'm out?
yeah.
Like what?
The multiple depends, right? It's a combination of how much, how profitable, how much revenue is the building, is the business making, and then for how much, you're buying an income. It's the same as, if you got 10 years left and you're making, X amount of return each year. It's just a formula, right? So if it's making 200,000 a year net to your pocket and you got 5 years left, and that's X amount of income. So how much are you willing to pay for that income?
Or sometimes you just want to retire and go live on a farm in Hudson and chill out.
Yep.
When it is the same person is asking a question, when is it a clear sign that a business should sell? Well, I can answer that. When you're losing money, first of all, if you're losing money month over month and you're trying to save the business and you've done all you can and it's just not working, then you should probably think about selling. Also, if you're not enjoying it anymore and you hate going to work and you're not treating your people well, that's usually a pretty good sign to sell as well. Well, that's about it, folks. Thank you all for coming. If you have any questions, david@helbronlevy.com. Feel free to hit me up. Cosmo Montemuro, Murrow Realty. They are on the ground doing deals all over the city. Give Cosmo a ring if you're thinking about buying or selling. Okay, take care.